Night air hangs low and wet over a city that believes itself untouchable. In that darkness, sirens begin to wail. At first, people think it's another drill. Then the low, unfamiliar growl of engines rolls in from the east. Not from the sea, not from any direction that makes sense for a Japanese bomber. They look up, expecting to see the long, thin silhouettes of Mitsubishi G3M or G4M bombers. Instead, over Tokyo on the night of April 18, 1942, they see something no one in Japan has ever seen before. American twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers, flying low over the rooftops, heading straight into the capital's heart. Inside one of those bombers, a pilot leans forward in his seat, eyes locked on the faint glow of Tokyo's streets below. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle checks his watch, then the bomb bay indicator, then the flickering skyline. This isn't supposed to be possible. Not technically, not tactically, not according to any pre-war Japanese calculation of American reach. Yet here he is, leading 15 other Mitchells, each carrying 4 500-pound bombs, each flown by men who volunteered for a mission they were told might not bring them home. He pushes the interphone button. Target ahead. Stand by. Behind him, the bombardier adjusts the Norden sights that, in this moment, are almost symbolic. The exact impact hardly matters. What matters is that American bombs are about to fall on Tokyo, and every man in that aircraft knows what that will do to Japanese confidence and to American morale. The first bombs tumble free. They whistle down into a city that believed the war would never touch it. Shocks ripple outward, not just through Tokyo's streets, but through the Japanese high command, the American press, and the entire strategic map of the Pacific. Yet to understand how those 16 bombers reached Tokyo at all, launched from a carrier deck never designed for them, flown at the edge of their range into unknown defenses, you have to step back from that moment in the dark sky. You have to follow one man who refused to accept that the Pacific War would be fought on Japanese terms. James Harold Doolittle was born in Alameda, California, in 1896, but he grew up in a country that still thought of aviation as a fragile novelty. By the time he entered the U.S. Army Signal Corps as a flying cadet in World War I, he had already earned a reputation. A small, wiry man with a calm voice and a risk tolerance that bordered on reckless. Known for his technical curiosity as much as his daring, he took leave not to rest, but to study. He earned a Doctor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from MIT, one of the very few American military aviators with that level of academic training. Yet, despite the degrees and test pilot credentials, what people remembered about Doolittle was not just his intellect. It was the way he flew. He performed high-risk demonstration flights, set speed records, and pushed aircraft into conditions most pilots avoided. Unlike many officers content to live within regulations, he constantly asked, what if we did it differently? What if a bomber could launch from a ship? What if range and surprise could be stretched beyond what doctrine allowed? However, on December 7, 1941, as Japanese carrier aircraft smashed into Pearl Harbor, it was not Doolittle in the headlines. It was a stunned America counting its dead battleships and wrecked aircraft. The United States had been hit in what was supposed to be its own secure harbor, and for months afterward, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific, seizing Guam, Wake, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. The reason the Doolittle Raid would matter so much is that it was born in this atmosphere of humiliation and fear. The American public needed proof that Japan's home islands were not invulnerable. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, faced a dilemma. The Navy's carriers were few and precious. The Army's long-range bombers couldn't yet reach Japan from any available base. While some argued for focusing entirely on rebuilding the Pacific Fleet and defending Australia, others urged a dramatic strike, something that would hit Japan directly and show both enemies and allies that the United States was not broken. Because of that pressure, a radical idea surfaced inside the planning cells: launch Army medium bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier. On paper, it bordered on fantasy. A B-25 Mitchell was roughly 53 feet long with a 67-foot wingspan, far larger than any aircraft normally launched from American flight decks. Its loaded takeoff run on land was hundreds of feet longer than a carrier deck could permit under normal conditions. Yet as soon as the concept reached Hap Arnold, one name came to mind: If anyone could test the boundaries of what aircraft could do, it was Jimmy Doolittle. Early in 1942, Doolittle was called to Army Air Forces headquarters. He was briefed in guarded language, a special mission, high risk, heavy secrecy. According to later accounts, when the idea of launching medium bombers from a carrier was outlined, he did not flinch. He listened, considered the aerodynamic and fuel constraints, and said simply that it could be done. If aircraft were modified, crews were trained, and the Navy cooperated fully. Yet even as he projected confidence, there were doubts beneath the surface. He was 45 years old, a senior officer who could easily have justified remaining behind the lines as a planner. If this failed, if the raid ended with bombers plunging into the sea or being swatted from the sky before reaching their targets, it would not just be a tactical setback. It would be a propaganda gift to Tokyo. Despite this, Doolittle insisted on leading the mission himself. For him, and for the men he would soon recruit, the risk was inseparable from the message. American officers would share the dangers they ordered others to face. To build the raiding force, Doolittle did not request a hand-picked elite from every corner of the air service. Instead, he turned to the 17th Bombardment Group, a B-25 unit based at Columbia Army Air Base in South Carolina. All crews were asked for volunteers for a dangerous mission. The exact target and method were not disclosed, but the phrase alone was enough. Men stepped forward knowing only that the odds were uncertain. There were no promises of glory, only the implication of high risk. Those volunteers were soon sent to Eglin Field in Florida. There, in the secrecy of the pine-lined runways and remote ranges, they began training for something that had never been done, taking off in a medium bomber in as little distance as a carrier deck could offer. They practiced short-field takeoffs, engines straining as pilots forced heavy B-25s into the air in well under 500 feet, over and over again until the unnatural became routine. At the same time, modifications were made to the aircraft themselves. Because of the range required, flying from a point at sea to Japan, then continuing on to airfields in China, every gallon of fuel mattered. The Mitchells had their defensive armament reduced, extra fuel tanks installed, and weight trimmed wherever possible. Some aircraft carried dummy guns, broomsticks painted black, to suggest tail armament and potentially discourage aggressive fighter attacks. While the crews trained in Florida, Navy planners and Army Air Forces officers argued over details. While some in the Navy believed carriers should be preserved strictly for naval battles, others, including Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Chester Nimitz, acknowledged the psychological value of striking Japan's home islands early. The USS Hornet, CV-8, a New Yorktown-class carrier, was selected as the launch platform. Its flight deck would be packed with 16 Army B-25s, lashed down in full view as the ship left San Francisco. Thus, a joint task force formed around two carriers, Hornet, carrying the bombers, and USS Enterprise, CV-6, whose air group would provide air cover against any Japanese naval or air threat. The reason for this dual-carrier arrangement was simple. Once the B-25s were launched, Hornet would be nearly defenseless in terms of aircraft. Enterprise's fighters and scout planes would have to shield the force as it approached the launch point. On April 2, 1942, Hornet departed San Francisco with 16 B-25s chained to her deck. To any distant observer, the sight would have been astonishing. Army land-based bombers lined up on a Navy carrier, their wings almost overlapping, their noses pointed at the bow as the ship plowed into the Pacific. That afternoon, once at sea and clear of prying eyes, Doolittle gathered the crews and told them what most had already guessed. They were going to bomb Japan itself. The room was quiet at first. Then, according to later recollections, excitement and nervous energy spread through the ranks. The men finally had a concrete answer to the question of why they had been practicing impossible takeoffs. They were going to carry the war to Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. Unknown to them, Japanese planners had considered the possibility of an American carrier raid, but had judged it unlikely that medium bombers could be used in such a way. Defenses around Japan were not as tight as they would later become. Coastal patrols existed, but the Japanese high command believed distance and offensive dominance would protect the home islands, at least for the war's early phase. For nearly 2 weeks, the task force steamed westward, a moving gamble on the Pacific. On April 18th, The ships closed within roughly 650 to 750 nautical miles of Japan, closer than any American carrier force had yet dared to operate. The plan was to approach to about 400 to 450 miles before launching, maximizing the B-25's fuel margin for the long leg to China. But war plans rarely survive contact with reality. In the early hours of that morning, Japanese picket boats, part of a dispersed warning line, spotted the task force. Although these boats were quickly engaged and sunk or disabled by the escorts, there was no certainty that no warning had been sent. Because of this, Admiral William "Bull" Halsey, commanding the task force, faced a grim choice. Either close the distance and maintain the planned launch point, risking counterattack by Japanese naval and air forces, or launch the bombers immediately from far beyond their intended range. While some might have argued for aborting the mission, that option would have squandered months of preparation and forfeited a rare opportunity to shock Japanese confidence. Doolittle, Halsey, and other commanders conferred by signal and voice. Ultimately, Halsey ordered the launch, hundreds of miles earlier than scheduled. Because of this decision, every crew now knew that reaching China would be even more uncertain. There would be no turning back to land on the carrier. These were one-way flights. Shortly after 8 a.m. in heavy seas, the first B-25 rolled forward on Hornet's deck. Waves rose and fell under the bow as the carrier turned into the wind, squeezing every extra knot of relative airflow over the deck. Doolittle himself took the first aircraft down the flight deck, engines at full power, holding until the last possible second before releasing the brakes. His B-25 roared forward, wheels bumping over tie-down points, then dropped slightly over the bow before clawing into the air. One by one, 15 more bombers followed. Pilots watched the white line at the deck's end, the green sea beyond, and the foaming wakes of the task force below. Any misjudgment in engine power, flap settings, or timing could mean a stall into the ocean. Yet every aircraft made it off. 16 B-25s turned west, low over the waves, leaving the task force and the safety of the American fleet behind. From here, the mission shifted from daring concept to grueling execution. Each crew navigated alone, using dead reckoning and limited radio communication to maintain course toward their assigned targets. They flew low over the Pacific to avoid detection, then began to climb as they neared the Japanese coast. Around midday, they reached the coastline of Honshu. Below them, Japanese fishing boats, coastal villages, and rail lines passed by, unaware at first that anything unusual was overhead. The aircraft split, each heading for its designated city. Doolittle's plane aimed for Tokyo, others for Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and additional industrial targets. Over Tokyo, anti-aircraft batteries reacted with stunned urgency. The sight of twin-engine bombers bearing American markings triggered confusion. Some gunners assumed they were Japanese aircraft in error, others fired regardless. Doolittle and his men flew through scattered bursts of flak, dropped their small bomb loads, designed more for psychological effect than strategic destruction, and pushed on, not turning back, only forward toward the unknown sky over the East China Sea. The raid's material damage was limited. Fires broke out, some factories and military facilities were hit, a few civilians killed or injured. The American bombs did not cripple Japanese industry, nor were they intended to. The real impact was psychological and strategic. For the first time, Japanese leaders and civilians alike saw that their capital could be reached by American aircraft, even at this early stage of the war. Because the launch had taken place so far from Japan, the flight to China stretched the B-25s to their limits. Fuel gauges edged toward empty. Weather deteriorated as night fell and clouds thickened. China, nominally friendly territory, was poorly mapped at low altitude and lacked radio beacons that could guide the bombers to specific fields. One crew, short on fuel and unable to reach China, turned north toward the Soviet Union, landing near Vladivostok. There, due to Soviet neutrality with Japan, the crew was interned rather than immediately repatriated. The other crews pressed on into darkness and cloud over China. Near midnight, crew after crew faced the same awful reality. Fuel exhausted, no runway in sight, high terrain beneath. Because of that combination, most Doolittle raiders crash-landed or bailed out over occupied or friendly Chinese territory. Some were injured upon landing. Others were helped by Chinese villagers and guerrillas who risked brutal Japanese reprisals to shelter them. Not all were so fortunate. 8 raiders were captured by Japanese forces in China. Of those, 3 were executed after a show trial. Others died in captivity, and only a few survived to return after the war. Chinese civilians suffered terribly. Japanese occupation forces launched ferocious retaliatory operations in areas suspected of aiding the Americans, killing tens of thousands. Back in the United States, news of the raid broke in late April. At first, details were vague. The public was told only that American bombers had struck Japan. Later, as more information was released, the image of bombers flying from somewhere in the Pacific captured the popular imagination. Because of this, Jimmy Doolittle became a national hero almost overnight. Promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor, he insisted that the real credit belonged to the crews and the Navy task force that made the raid possible. Privately, he had expected to be court-martialed if the raid failed. The damage on the ground had been modest, the cost in aircraft total. Yet the morale impact was precisely what Washington had hoped for. Americans could now point to a bold counterstrike and believe that the war would not be a one-way parade of Japanese victories. Inside Japan, the shock was deeper and more complicated. Publicly, the Imperial Navy and Army sought to minimize the raid's significance. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, allegedly dismissed it as a minor, do-nothing raid in terms of military effect. However, beneath that public posture, he and other strategists were deeply disturbed. The reason for their concern was not the bomb damage itself, but what it revealed about American capabilities and intentions. If the Americans could bring medium bombers within range of Tokyo once, they could do it again, perhaps with larger forces or from new bases closer to Japan. Japan's entire war plan hinged on a secure defensive perimeter, stretching from the Aleutians and Midway across the Central Pacific to the Dutch East Indies and beyond. That perimeter was meant to keep American bombers far away while Japanese forces consolidated their gains. Because of the Doolittle Raid, Yamamoto became even more determined to extend that perimeter eastward. He argued that the only way to prevent similar raids and to break American offensive potential was to lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them. Thus, the raid contributed directly to his push for an operation against Midway Atoll, a small American outpost whose capture would threaten Hawaii and project Japanese power farther into the Pacific. While some Japanese army leaders prioritized campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, and others favored consolidating existing positions, the Navy's insistence on an eastern offensive gained momentum. The raid had embarrassed the high command domestically, undermined the myth of invulnerability, and exposed weaknesses in home island air defenses. As a result, political and military pressures converged to approve a risky thrust toward Midway, scheduled for June 1942. At Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with many of its most experienced pilots. That battle is widely regarded as a turning point in the Pacific War, shifting the strategic initiative from Japan to the United States. Because of this chain, Pearl Harbor, the Doolittle Raid, then Midway, historians often point to Doolittle's mission as a classic example of how a relatively small tactical operation can exert disproportionate strategic influence. For the raiders themselves, life did not end with their return from China and captivity. Those who made it back continued to serve in combat theaters across the globe. Doolittle went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and later the 8th Air Force in Europe, directing massive strategic bombing campaigns. Yet for many of the men who had bounced down that wet wooden deck on Hornet, the memory of April 18, 1942, remained singular. The day they flew a mission that logic said should not work, and did it anyway. In later years, at their reunions, the surviving raiders gathered around silver goblets engraved with each man's name. As comrades passed away, their cups were turned upside down, a quiet ritual of remembrance. They did not describe themselves as superhuman heroes, but as ordinary airmen who had volunteered when asked. The human side of the raid, the fear during low-level approaches over Tokyo, the uncertainty over China, the guilt over Chinese reprisals, never entirely faded from their voices. What makes the Doolittle Raid stand out is not its bomb tonnage or its kill counts. It is the way it forced both sides to rethink what was possible. For the Americans, it proved that ingenuity and cooperation between services could overcome severe geographic and logistical disadvantages. For the Japanese, it shattered the illusion that distance and a string of early victories would insulate the homeland from retaliation. Because 16 bombers launched from a single carrier on a gray April morning, Japanese admirals pushed for a decisive engagement they believed they could win, and lost instead. Because of a mission that destroyed relatively little concrete and steel, the psychological and strategic balance in the Pacific began to tilt. In the end, the Doolittle Raid was a story of 80 men boarding 16 overloaded bombers on the deck of USS Hornet, flying into a ranged circle that barely closed over China, guided as much by resolve as by compass headings. It was the story of a commander whose combination of technical knowledge and personal courage allowed him to say yes when others might have said impossible. And it was the story of how a single, improbable operation could ripple outward through propaganda offices, war rooms, and morale on both sides, until it helped shape the decision that led to Midway and beyond. Did this change how you view this daring mission and its consequences for the Pacific War? Which part of this story stands out most to you? The impossible carrier launch, the night over Tokyo, or the long, uncertain flight to China? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden turning points of World War II that reshaped the world.